After Bernie Sanders exited the Democratic primary, a coalition of progressive groups sent Joe Biden a letter with calls to support specific policies in order to gain their specific endorsement. Now, 51 anti-war groups across ideological lines have adopted a similar strategy.
So the letter asks for a principled foreign policy, which includes cutting support for the AUMF, the authorized use of military force, and decreasing the defense budget by $200 billion. Joining us now to explain more is the Huffington Post political reporter Daniel Marans, a friend of the show. Good to see you, Dan. How are you? Great. Dan, explain to us a little bit about the letter. Tell us about what the motivations of that group are and whether you see it catching on as something that Joe Biden might have to answer for in this election.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Foreign policy was not a major issue in the Democratic primary this cycle. I would say it was even bigger in 2016. Obviously, in 2008, it was a major issue. And so if you're a progressive group, let's say, one of these sort of more liberal faith groups or an anti-war group that was not just concerned about foreign policy under President Trump, but was really concerned about it under President Obama, things like U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen, U.S. backing of the Israeli government and sort of its policies in terms of settlement expansion, you needed more than a return to normalcy, as liberal groups have been saying with respect to domestic policy. The difference on foreign policy is it gets less attention, but on the flip side, you do have at least one or two players that aren't from traditional liberal walks of life, like the Quincy Institute, which is backed by both Soros and the Koch brothers. And so their effort is to kind of do what other people have been trying to do to Biden and say, look, we don't have a ton of leverage over you, but we actually have a constituency that will be more excited to turn out and vote for you if you commit to not just undoing some of Trump's excesses, but frankly also keeping some of his more diplomatic approaches and going further than that. They have some reason to be hopeful based on Biden's activities during the Obama administration. Obviously has a long record of being hawkish.
Yeah. And what do you think the receptivity has been from the Biden campaign thus far? I mean, essentially the outcome from the other progressive groups that sent their letter saying, yeah, we're going to vote for you, but people will be more excited to vote for you if you do X, Y, and Z. It looks like them, combined with Sanders dropping out of the race, got these task forces. We'll see what comes out of that. Do you see receptivity from the Biden campaign to this list of demands?
Well, they haven't responded formally to it yet, but I have to wonder whether they knew it was coming, because literally a day before the letter came out, they came out with a proposal, a quote, plan for Muslim Americans. And in that plan, it included increasing the annual refugee intake to 125,000 people. Now, the highest amount, and that was specifically the figure that these groups asked for in their letter as part of their broader foreign policy. So obviously civil liberties and some immigration stuff was in there as well. Now, going back to the Obama administration, Obama, I don't think he ever let in more than 50 or 60,000. He was asking for 110. So 125, it would be a really significant leap in terms of the number of refugees taken in. And I think that was more the area that they were interested in sort of accommodating these groups' demands. I think, look, when it comes to foreign policy, and frankly, I expect when it comes to things like financial and trade policy as well, these are areas where the president has a lot more discretion to go it alone without Congress. And I suspect that Biden, who is somewhat experienced in foreign policy, will be reluctant to yield ground on that.
I think that's really the dynamic here, Dan. You can have all the letters you want. Look, the man was Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman, right? Like, beat the war drum for Iraq. We know what he thinks on TPP. We know what he thinks on NAFTA, PNTR. There's a long record here that we can go back and change. How are groups, based on your reporting, how are groups grappling with that? Because, look, you can write all the protest letters you want. You got to know that it's just not going to make a difference. And as you say, trade and foreign policy, war, those are the two things that are most up to the commander-in-chief.
Yeah, so I think the groups are grappling with it feebly and just doing what they honestly can. I think trade is interesting because Richard Trumka, the president of the AFL-CIO, the largest labor union federation in the country, represents 13 million Americans, has said that they still need assurances from Biden on that. And a lot of individual unions haven't formally endorsed Biden. that's something where I think the leverage is even more credible, because in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, that's an extraordinarily live issue, and it's extremely important. But as you noted, Sagar, he has a long history on this. His policy advisors, figures like Bruce Reed, who was in the Clinton administration and then was on the Bull-Simpson Commission,
right,
are really stalwarts of kind of the neoliberal Democratic establishment. In terms of foreign interventionism, though, I think that there are some potential, you might say green shoots, if you will, or bright spots, which is that during the Obama administration, Biden apparently was somebody who spoke up against the escalation in Afghanistan and actually claims to have opposed the sort of regime change operation in Libya, unlike Hillary Clinton. So that may be something he can point to. I think obviously China is a huge weakness. And then I add another factor, another variable here, which is that, and this may add some weight to these anti-war groups' demands, which is Justin Amash. I mean, if you're somebody who doesn't like Biden or Trump, and specifically if you are opposed to U.S. adventurism abroad, Justin Amash, a sort of anti-interventionist libertarian, might be a natural go-to.
That's interesting.
That's a good point. And what more do we know about not only who Biden is surrounding himself with now in terms of foreign policy advice, but who's been floated for these cabinet positions?
Well, obviously, I mean, it's very early, very premature, but I think that Pete Buttigieg's people would like to see him as ambassador to the United Nations or in some kind of a high-ranking defense role, possibly even defense secretary. and I think that's probably the most that I've heard at this point. In terms of Secretary of State, I think that obviously Susan Rice has been in the mix for vice president. She's certainly someone from that sort of centrist neoliberal foreign policy establishment. And I don't think that they're going to have somebody who's never run for elected office as vice president. So we could see a figure like that at state. Again, if you're Joe Biden and you've won this thing in a landslide and you're throwing progressives' bones on college, healthcare, and maybe even climate, though we haven't exactly seen that yet, why do you think that you're obligated to sort of bend to them on foreign policy? We'll see. As I said, I think there are other factors that could be pushing in that direction, the kind of Amash threat and the possibility of, on trade, the issue of organized labor. I would even add to that mix the Muslim American population in Michigan, which is significant enough to sway an election there, and they're also very anti-interventionist. So
yeah, certainly.
Very interesting. Daniel Marans, always great to see you. Thanks,
you.
Dan.
Great being here.
See you, sir.
We'll have more for you after this.